Hello, welcome again. I'm happy to have you back, and I want to believe that you are well and safe where you are, and that you are keeping safer again and again by following government measures. So, welcome to today's biology lesson, and today we are going to delve into the nerve impasse. I want to believe that you'll be able to learn one or two things as you join me. Now, before we continue, I want us to remember about a section in Form 1 when we discussed about the properties of a nerve cell. And we said that a nerve cell is a specialized cell that is involved in conduction or transmission of a nerve impulse. And we said that a nerve cell, for it to perform its role, it has some modification. That means involving the dendrites, the cytosol, which is the cell body, and then the axon. Now, aside of the modifications that we mentioned of the nerve fiber or the nerve cell, simply put, the neuron, we said it has some critical features or properties that assist in its function. Now, one of the property of a nerve cell, as we said, is the possession of electric charges. That is, the anions and the cations, meaning that it has positively charged ions and the negatively charged ions. So that possession makes it have a property that we refer to as it being polarized. So that means that a non-conducting nerve fiber is polarized. That is, more positive ions outside the cell membrane and more negative ions inside the cell membranes. Those two ions are the ones that we refer to as the charges. And it is due to the changes on the charges, that is, whether the negative charges are outside the cell membrane and then subsequently the positive charges are pumped into the cell membrane, that brings about what we call a nerve impulse. So before we delve into a nerve impulse, there are two objectives that I want you to pay attention to. Objective number one, you will be expected to explain a term, a nerve impulse, and then number two, you will be expected to describe the process of generation and transmission of nerve impulse along an axon. And lastly, one that will be involved in a different clip is once a nerve impulse has been transmitted along a nerve cell, it is passed over. It is passed over in a process that we call a synapse. So we shall look at that as the third one, but I want us to deal with the two in this clip. So let's answer this question: what a nerve impulse is. A nerve impulse is a wave of electrical disturbance across and along the nerve cell. So as I was saying, that a nerve cell possesses charges. When there is a shift in the type of the charges that are outside and those that are inside the cell membrane, you realize that it brings about a disturbance. And that disturbance is the one that we refer to as a nerve impulse. So sometimes we refer to it as depolarization that occurs across the membrane of a cell. Depolarization that occurs across the membrane of a nerve cell. Now, this depolarization is brought about by the changes involving the ions, the positive ions and the negative ions, in what we refer to as the charges. So once an impulse is generated, the changes that involves those ions are the ones that will lead to creation of an earth impulse. And that impulse will always be traveling along an axon. But remember, the disturbance is just taking place within or at the cell membrane. So we need to understand that there are several terms that is important for us to pay attention to, for us to understand how a nerve impulse travels along an axon. One of the terms is polarization, the other one is depolarization, and the last one is repolarization. If I may start, polarization simply means the possession or the presence of positively charged ions outside the cell membrane, and more negative charged ions inside the cell membrane. Remember, the ions that we are mentioning here are the sodium ions and potassium ions, and more so to the anions or the negative charges, the chloride ions together with some inorganic ions. So what we simply mean here is that if we have more potassium ion and sodium ions to the outside of the cell membrane, that membrane is said to be polarized. For a depolarized membrane, it is a membrane that refers to a cell or a nerve fiber that is in a conducting state. That means that an impulse has been created and it is being transmitted or conducted along the axon. So in this case, there are more sodium ions inside the nerve cell or inside the membrane inside the membrane of the nerve cell. So I want to repeat that in a depolarized nerve cell, there are more cations, there are more positively charged ions inside the cell membrane of a nerve cell than it is outside the cell membrane of a nerve cell. So outside the membrane of a nerve cell, there are anions or negatively charged ions, and these could be due to higher accumulation of potassium ions together with the chloride ions. And such a membrane or such a nerve cell is said to be in a conducting state, meaning that it is allowing the transmission of a nerve impulse from axon to axon. Now, the exchange of ions initiates an action potential in the neuron. So a conducting neuron is said to be in an action potential, meaning that if it is in that state, there is an impulse that is being transmitted. A nerve fiber that does not, remember this occurs within milliseconds, that is not transmitting a nerve impulse is said to be in a resting state. Now let's let's use diagrams to explain what we've just been saying. Now, in the first instance here, our nerve is polarized. Our nerve is polarized, meaning that there are more sodium ions to the outside of the cell membrane of the nerve cell than it is to the inside. So as you can see here, there are more sodium ions. Remember, sodium ions are positively charged, and that's why we refer to them as cations in chemistry and physics. And inside the nerve cell or the neuron, the membrane has more negatively charged ions and a few potassium ions. So this membrane is said to be in a resting state, what we call a resting potential. Now, what makes it possible for more sodium ions to be pumped out is because of two factors. Factor number one is because of a mechanism that we refer to as the sodium-potassium pump. Sodium-potassium pump. So in a resting potential, the sodium-potassium pump is actively extruding or pumping out the sodium ions or positive ions, and therefore they settle outside the cell membrane of a nerve fiber, whereas leaving behind the negatively charged ions inside the cell membrane of the nerve cell. So this membrane, as it is here, is in a resting state, and therefore that means that it has not picked up an impulse. It is not transmitting an impulse. So factor number two that enables the extrusion or pumping out of sodium ions is that during this stage, the cell membrane becomes more permeable to sodium ions, and therefore they can be pumped out. The cell membrane becomes more permeable, therefore the sodium ions or positively charged ions are pumped out. Now, in the process, the membrane, this process can last for milliseconds, between 1 and 5 milliseconds. So during that process, there is another mechanism that ensures that more sodium ions again are pumped into the cell membrane of the nerve cell. So when more sodium ions are pumped into the cell membrane, it leads to a change in terms of net charges inside and outside the cell membrane. That means that within seconds, the inside of the cell membrane of a nerve cell will become or will be having positive charges, as the negative charges are also pumped to the opposite direction, that is outside, and they settle outside the cell membrane of a nerve cell. And this is what leads to a phenomenon that we refer to as the action potential. And in an action potential, the membrane or the neuron is conducting an impulse. The neuron is conducting an impulse. So, in short, we are saying that during action potential, there are more positive ions inside the cell membrane than they are outside the cell membrane of a nerve fiber. So this is the mechanism that allows the transmission of a nerve impulse. That it is actually a very quick interchange between polarization and depolarization. Now, the process of restoring positive charges to the outside of a nerve impulse so as to attain a polarized neuron is what we call repolarization. So in repolarization, we are restoring the natural status of a nerve cell, that is, having more positive ions to the outside of the cell membrane than they are inside the cell membrane. And remember, such a neuron is said to be in a resting state or a polarized state. So, because of these processes taking place in phases, you realize that you will end up having a graph that shows the interchange between when a nerve is transmitted and when a nerve is not transmitted along the nerve fiber. So in this diagram here, we have a state where there is no stimulus. But if there is a stimulus, at this point, there is no stimulus. After some period of time, when there is a stimulus that has, when a nerve cell picks up or is stimulated, it picks up an impulse and then it changes into a depolarized state. This state is the one that we refer to as the action potential. It reaches a peak upon which, again, within milliseconds, the nerve impulse allows the active pumping out of sodium ions so as to restore the resting phase in what we call the repolarization. So at this phase, it is the repolarization state. And then once it is done, then the membrane will said to be in a resting state. So this one may not be so important for our syllabus now, but it is important for you to know that there is a very rapid interchange between the two phases in any given time. So again, a non-conducting neuron is said to be in a resting state, but a conducting neuron is said to be in an action potential, meaning that an impulse has been generated or created and it is transmitted along the axon. Thank you.